"He's not comin', darlin'. Rodrigo ain't comin'." The words slipped through Pastor Avery's lips, like they burned him thick with disbelief. His voice trembled barely a whisper, but loud enough to kill the music, hush the guests, and snatch the breath clean from Hannah Montclair's chest. She stood there frozen in the middle of the church aisle, gripping a bouquet of wild lilies so tight her knuckles turned bone white. Her white satin gown shimmered under the dusty sunlight sneaking through stained glass, but all the light in the world couldn't cover the sudden cold that crawled down her spine. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears louder than the organ music, louder than the silence that followed. Pastor Avery held out a small folded piece of paper no bigger than a grocery receipt. "I got this text a minute ago. Says, 'I can't. Don't come looking for me.' That's all, child. Nothing else." Just like that, the world cracked. Hannah blinked, staring past the old pastor like he was a ghost, past the full pews of Dust Creek's finest, and past the altar where Rodrigo should have been standing. Her eyes stung, her knees wobbled, and somewhere behind her someone gasped. Someone else whispered her name like a prayer, or a pity. "Lord have mercy," muttered old Mrs. Harper from the front row, clutching her pearls like they might shield her from secondhand shame. The entire church shifted. Heads turned, hats tilted, fans stopped flapping. Men whispered behind their hands. Women looked away, afraid they might catch whatever curse just fell on the Montclair family. And still Hannah didn't move. Not a step, not even a blink. Her grandmother, Carmen Montclair, rose from the front pew with the kind of grace that came from surviving dust storms and Wall Street crashes alike. The old woman's cane tapped sharply on the wooden floor as she approached the altar, her pearl brooch glinting like a badge of war. "Give it here," she told the pastor, snatching the phone from his hand with her bony fingers. One glance at the message was all she needed. Her jaw clenched so tight her dentures clicked. Coward. Behind her, the hush broke into a low tide of whispers. Did he run off? Was she expecting poor thing look at her? Hannah couldn't hear them. She wasn't really in the church anymore. She was 13 again, chasing fireflies in her father's orchard. She was 23, dancing barefoot with Rodrigo under the summer stars. She was 29 today, her 30th birthday just 9 hours away, and now she was a bride without a groom, a Montclair without a future. And worse, her grandfather's words came crashing back like a blow to the chest. No marriage by 30, no inheritance. It had sounded like a joke at first, something an old man said to keep tradition alive. But lawyers don't joke. Wills don't bend. And today, with the ink on her marriage license still wet and no groom in sight, that clause might as well be her death sentence. Because if she didn't marry by midnight, the Montclair estate, 5,000 acres of ranch land, 3 textile mills, and the family name wouldn't belong to her. It'd go to the only other blood Montclair still breathing. Ricardo. That conniving, sharp-smiled weasel of a cousin who'd been circling like a buzzard since Granddaddy died. He'd been run out of the family 10 years ago for skimming off the ranch payroll, but he never stayed gone long. And now he'd be back with a vengeance, ready to take it all and her along with it if he had his way. Hannah blinked hard and turned, pushing past Carmen and the pastor, past the gawking guests, and frozen flower girls, past the altar where her dreams lay broken like cheap china. Someone called her name. A woman's voice, her aunt maybe, or a friend. She didn't look back. The heavy church doors banged open as she stepped out into the blistering light, the gravel path crunching beneath her heels. A storm had been brewing all morning, and now the wind picked up with a mean edge. Her veil whipped behind her like a kite with no string, and her dress snagged on the dry prairie grass as she ran. Not far from the church, the sky cracked open. First came the dust, dry and angry, kicking up from the road like it had a score to settle. Then came the wind howling through the narrow streets of Dust Creek, like a voice raised in warning. Then came the rain. Fat, cold drops that hit the dry earth like tears hitting stone. They turned dust into mud and made her satin shoes stick with every step. Hannah didn't stop. She didn't know where she was going, just that she had to move, had to run. because if she stood still 1 second longer, the shame might bury her alive. Her wedding gown, once a masterpiece of hand-stitched lace and pearl detailing, was soaked, sagging, ruined. Her curls stuck to her face. Her makeup ran. She looked less like a bride and more like a ghost dragged through the backwoods. By the time she reached the edge of town, the roads were near empty. The saloon had gone quiet. The church bells had long stopped ringing. And still, she kept walking. She reached the old train yard behind Galloway's Feed and Supply, a place kids used to dare each other to sneak into after dark. It was half abandoned now. The old freight cars rusted out the sheds, leaning like old men too tired to stand straight. And there, among the broken rails and the rain, it all came rushing back like a reel of film. Her mind couldn't stop replaying even if she wanted to. 3 years ago, she'd met Rodrigo Hayes at a graduation party thrown by the local business college in Amarillo. He was older, polished, with that natural charm some men don't even know they have. Tall, dark-haired, well-dressed, and with a smile so confident it could sell a broken wagon as brand new. At 27, Hannah had been bright-eyed, ambitious, and truth be told, ready for a fairy tale. Rodrigo had seemed like just that. He was a rising financial consultant with a Dallas firm, and he had a way of listening to her that made her feel like her dreams mattered. She'd talk about the family business, about how hard it was to keep a fourth-generation operation alive in a modern world, and he'd lean in all ears like she was the only person in the room. "You've got a gift," he'd tell her over pancakes in some dusty roadside diner. "You got vision. With my know-how and your fire, we'd be unstoppable." And for a while, she believed it. She believed in them. He fit into her picture-perfect future like a hand in a glove. The Montclair name meant something in Dust Creek. Her great-grandfather had founded the first textile mill back in 1923, turning sheep's wool and rough cotton into fine goods that sold as far as Houston. Her grandfather, Don Eduardo, had taken that legacy and built an empire, diversifying into ranching logistics, even oil leases out west. He was brilliant, gruff, traditional to the bone. And when he died at 89, he left behind a will as sharp-edged as he'd lived. The clause was simple, cruel, and impossible to ignore. The heir to Montclair and Sons must be married by their 30th birthday. No exceptions, no extensions. If she didn't marry, everything would go to the next eligible blood relative, which brought her to Ricardo Montclair. Ricardo was her late uncle's boy, 15 years older than her, with a string of failed ventures and half-truths trailing behind him like busted boots. After a series of borrowed payrolls and shady investments, he'd been cut off and cast out by the family. But after Don Eduardo died, Ricardo started popping up again. Church potlucks, town council meetings, quiet visits to the office just to say hi. He claimed he'd changed, that he wanted to mend fences. What he really wanted was her birthright. Hannah had never feared him. Not really. She figured he was all bark, no bite. She even invited him to the wedding. Family's family, she'd said. She hadn't known how close he'd been watching. Not until later. Rodrigo, for all his charm, had cracks Hannah never saw. His finances were a mess, bad investments mounting gambling debts, loans with shady terms. But he kept up the image so well, so perfectly, that she never thought to look deeper. Ricardo did. One chilly night in July, Ricardo met Rodrigo at a private bar in Amarillo. It was the kind of place where handshakes mattered more than receipts and deals got made with a nod. "You look tense," Ricardo had said casually, sipping a whiskey and watching Rodrigo squirm into his seat. Rodrigo, already on his third drink, let it spill. The debt, the pressure, the dread. "She deserves better," he said. "I'm not who she thinks I am." Ricardo leaned in. "Then don't ruin her life by pretending." And like a devil in a dark coat, Ricardo made his pitch. 500,000 reais, enough to clear Rodrigo's slate and buy him a new one. All Rodrigo had to do was disappear. No drama, no note, no explanation. Just vanish on the morning of the wedding. Rodrigo resisted at first. Said it felt wrong. Said he loved her. But debt eats love like rust eats steel. And Ricardo knew exactly how to make rot look like mercy. So the deal was made shaken on in the shadows behind the parking lot, away from any curious eyes. The next morning, Rodrigo was gone. And Hannah was left with a text, a crowd of whispers, and a clock ticking down on her family's legacy. Now soaking wet and sitting alone in the ruins of a freight yard, she finally felt the full weight of it. All of it. Her heart broken. Her name tarnished. Her inheritance slipping like river mud through her fingers. And worst of all, she had no idea that this betrayal had been planned like a business deal. Cold, clean, ruthless. As the thunder rolled overhead, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. She was tired of crying, tired of running. She wanted to scream. She could have believed Rodrigo just didn't love her enough. Maybe that was the hardest part of it. That his silence, his absence, was his final truth. That all the words he'd said before were just filler. That he'd rather vanish than stand beside her and fight for a life together. Maybe she was the only one who saw a future. Maybe he'd seen an exit. That kind of hurt didn't feel like fire. It felt like a slow, cold drowning. And the rejection, if it had been private, whispered in a quiet kitchen, or written in a letter she could burn, might have hurt less. But to be left at the altar under the eyes of a town that measured worth by loyalty and legacy, that wound was wide open. And the hours were slipping. Midnight loomed like a cliff edge, every minute marching toward it with quiet cruelty. If she wasn't married by then, the Montclair name, the ranch, the mills, the land, all of it would fall into Ricardo's lap. Everything her family had bled for, everything she had trained for, gone. She stopped at the corner where North Main met Cedar Street, sagging against an old lamppost, as if it could carry what her legs couldn't anymore. The rain had calmed to a whisper now, just a soft mist clinging to everything. Her wedding dress clung to her skin like wet newspaper. Heavy, cold, almost mocking. A few townsfolk passed by their faces, half hidden behind umbrellas, their eyes lingering just long enough to register her, then darting away like she was something contagious. Not one stopped. Not one said a word. She whispered to herself, voice hoarse from silence. I need to think. There's gotta be a way out of this. But where did a woman find a husband in under 8 hours? Where did she find someone who wouldn't ask too many questions or worse, laugh in her face? What kind of man would look at her mud-streaked, soaked through, desperate, and say yes? And more terrifying, what if no one would? She clenched her jaw, trying to focus, trying to gather whatever pieces of dignity hadn't washed away in the rain. She thought of the only person who'd ever taught her how to handle a storm without flinching. Her grandma. Her grandmother had survived the Dust Bowl, the death of a son, the slow erosion of old money in a new world. She was part matriarch, part general, and part ghost whisperer when it came to hard decisions. What would she do? Hannah muttered, barely audible under the drizzle. Carmen always said, there ain't no such thing as a problem without a door. Just gotta find the one that ain't locked. Hannah held on to that now like it was scripture. Still, her body was giving out. Her legs ached. Her spine bent forward under the weight of the soaked gown. Her breath caught as she tried to straighten. And then her heel slipped. The sidewalk was slick, worn smooth from years of boots and rain. In a blink, her footing vanished and gravity took hold. The world slowed. She felt herself pitch forward, arms scrambling through empty air. Her skirt billowed up like wings on a dying bird, and the cold concrete came rushing to meet her. This was it, the final humiliation. Abandoned, soaked, and about to land flat on her face in front of the boarded-up storefront of Hank's Shoe Repair. But she didn't fall. A hand, strong, solid, caught her by the forearm with the kind of grip that came from years of honest labor. It held her, not yanked or jerked, but held her just firm enough to stop the fall, just gentle enough to remind her she was still human. She looked up, breath short, heart still rattling in her chest, and saw him. A man, maybe 35, maybe younger. Hard to say with the scruff on his chin and the deep lines in his brow. His boots were worn smooth, his coat too thin for the rain, but his eyes dark, quiet, steady, met hers with a calm that made her knees buckle. "You all right, miss?" His voice was low, like the slow creak of a porch swing at sunset. Hannah opened her mouth, then closed it again. She'd seen him before she realized. Once or twice around town, digging fence posts behind the hardware store, hauling crates behind the butcher shop. Folks said he was Apache, a drifter, kept to himself. Didn't ask for charity but wouldn't refuse day work. No one knew his name. No one cared to. And now here she was, a Montclair soaked to the bone, dressed in a ruined bridal gown, standing in front of him like a beggar in lace. No, this wasn't the kind of poverty you're born into and never escape. This was something else entirely. This was the kind of man who'd once known better days, someone who'd stood taller once, maybe in better clothes under clearer skies, and now fought tooth and nail just to keep his dignity intact. Not broken, just bruised by life in a way that made you carry yourself quieter. Hannah held onto his arm, still steadying herself, the world spinning just a little less now that he was there. "Thank you," she murmured the words, small, trembling. I almost fell." "I saw," he said simply. His voice was calm, almost grounding. "You looked like you were having a hard time." That caught her off guard. Not because it wasn't true, but because he said it so plainly. No pity, no judgment, just a quiet truth. Then, almost like he was reading her mind, he asked, "Forgive me for asking, but it's not every day you see a bride walking down Main Street in the rain, especially not alone. You all right?" Her cheeks flushed redder than they'd been in hours, part cold, part shame. It hit her all over again just how absurd she must look. Veil stuck to her face, dress dragging mud soaked to the bone, talking to a complete stranger under a busted streetlight. "I'm Hannah," she said out of habit, like she was still someone with a last name that mattered. He smiled a little, not wide, just enough to soften the rough lines of his face. "Miguel," he said. "Miguel Santana. And you look like you could use a dry spot. Maybe even someone to talk to." There was something about the way he spoke, quiet but clear. His words weren't fancy, but they were well-chosen, deliberate, like he'd been taught to respect them. There was a kind of education in his tone, not the kind you get from books, but from surviving and watching and knowing when to shut up and when to speak. Hannah hesitated, caught between her instincts and exhaustion. "I don't know if I should—" "Look," he interrupted gently, lifting one hand in peace. "I don't know what happened today, and I'm not asking. But I can see pain when it's walking straight down the sidewalk in heels. There's a storefront just over there, shop closed early. Got a little awning you could stand under, get out of this rain." She followed his gaze. Just across the street, a small shop with iron bars on the windows and an old faded sign. The lights were out, but there was shelter. Her body ached from the weight of the dress, from the weight of disappointment of holding herself together too long. She nodded. As they walked those short 20 yards, Miguel stayed close, but not too close, keeping pace beside her, not leading, not pushing. Just there. When they ducked under the awning, the rain picked up again like the sky had been waiting for its cue. Thunder grumbled in the distance, slow and low. Hannah leaned back against the brick wall, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath since noon. Miguel stood near the edge of the awning, blocking most of the wind with his frame. He didn't say much, didn't ask. Just let the quiet stretch out long enough for her to catch up to herself. "You were coming from that church on Augusta, right?" he asked finally. She turned to him, surprised. "You saw passed by a little after 3?" he said. Folks were pouring out dressed like it was Founder's Day, some looking confused, some in tears. I figured someone got stood up. Guess that was you. His voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel. She looked down at her dress, then back at him. "I guess so." He nodded once. "They serve meals at that church on Wednesdays," he said after a beat. "Been doing it for years. Sometimes I'm around there. Grab a plate, lend a hand." His honesty came like a slap. Not hard, but sharp in its clarity. In her world, people lied by omission, danced around vulnerability like it was a shameful thing. But here was a man who admitted it plain. No pride, no groveling, just truth. I'm sorry, she said without even knowing why. He tilted his head. Ain't nothing to be sorry for. Then he smiled again, just a flicker. Life's got seasons. Some are lean, others ain't. Dignity's in how you carry yourself through both. There was something in the way he said it, like it came from deep living, not just words. She found herself watching him more closely now. Miguel glanced at her again, more gently this time. Can I ask what happened? She stiffened, then relaxed again just as fast. It had been hours of silence, of bottled shame and rattling thoughts. Maybe it was the stranger in him, or maybe it was because he asked without any demand. I was supposed to be married today, she said, the words catching in her throat before they stumbled out. At 3 o'clock, full church, family, press even. He sent a text, said he couldn't do it, told me not to look for him. Miguel didn't gasp, didn't blink hard or mutter sympathy. He just nodded slowly. That's a hell of a thing, he said. I'm sorry, Miss Hannah. She stared straight ahead. That's not even the worst of it. All right. She laughed bitterly. I have to be married by midnight tonight. Legally. It's a clause in my grandfather's will. If I don't, I lose everything. The business. The land. All of it goes to my cousin Ricardo, and trust me, he's been circling like a vulture for years. Miguel went quiet. He looked down at the cracked sidewalk, then at the sky, then finally back to her. What time is it now? He asked, pulling a small wristwatch from under his sleeve. Little after 8, she said, confused. He nodded thoughtfully. 4 hours, he murmured. Might be enough. Enough for what? He turned to her then, and the look in his eyes made her hold her breath. Enough time to get married. The words hung in the air like smoke. She blinked. What? You said you need a husband before midnight, Miguel replied like he was explaining a hardware order. I got nothing to lose. You got everything to lose. We could help each other. Her mouth opened, then shut, then opened again. But we don't even know each other. True, he said. But I'm not asking for forever. Just tonight. Just enough to keep you from losing your name and what comes with it. She stared at him like he'd gone mad. And yet deep down, she didn't feel afraid. Why, she whispered. Why would you do this for me? He looked out into the rain, his voice low. 'Cause sometimes folks need a break. A door like your grandma said. And maybe I'd like to matter again. Even just for one night. Hannah stared at him for a long moment, her breathing shallow, her chest rising and falling like she'd just climbed a hill. Something about the way he said it plain without a hint of self-pity hit her right in the ribs. She didn't say yes. She just nodded. Once. Small. But it was all he needed. 15 minutes later, they were climbing the steps of the old Montclair house, soaked to the bone, her veil trailing behind her like a ghost that wouldn't let go. The house loomed in the rain like a sleeping memory, 3 stories of stone and time with gables that leaned into the wind and windows that watched everything. The porch light cast a warm glow across the wet porch, but Hannah didn't feel its comfort. Not yet. Miguel stood beside her, silent but steady. No fidgeting, no false humility, just quiet awareness. When the front door opened, the warmth from inside swept out and wrapped around them like a wool coat. And there stood Grandma Montclair, her frame tall despite age, her silver hair pulled into a tight twist, her eyes sharp as broken glass behind wire-frame spectacles. Hannah braced herself. Mama, she said softly, using the old family nickname. I need your help. Grandma's eyes dropped immediately to the man beside her. You brought him here. The words weren't shouted, but they hit just the same. Hannah felt them as if her dress had been ripped down the middle. This is Miguel. He helped me. I asked him to marry me. Before midnight. There was a stillness then, thick and stretched. The kind of silence that feels like the house itself is holding its breath. You... what? Carmen's voice cracked like a branch in winter. You show up at my door in that state with a stranger, an Apache no less, and tell me you plan to marry him tonight. Miguel shifted slightly, just enough to show respect, not enough to back down. I know how this looks, ma'am, he said, calm as ever. But I ain't here for your money. I'm just trying to help her do what needs doing. You think I'm blind? Carmen snapped. I've lived long enough to know what men do when they sniff opportunity. And folks around town folks talk. They say there's one of you that spends more time blending in with white folks than staying with his own kind. Ain't that right? Grandma Hannah's voice cracked, part outrage, part heartbreak. Please. But Carmen wasn't done. An Apache man who works odd jobs, lives in the shadows, shows up on the day my granddaughter is humiliated in front of the whole damn county, and now you're standing here asking for a wedding. I asked him. Hannah interrupted, voice trembling. He didn't come to me. I came to him. He caught me when I was fallen, literally and otherwise. Carmen turned her stare on Hannah now. Cold, measuring. But beneath it, worry. I know you're scared, the old woman said. But you're not thinking clearly. I am. Hannah shot back, her voice rising for the first time all day. For the first time all damn day I am. He didn't promise me love. He didn't even promise me tomorrow. He just gave me a chance to hold on to what's mine. I'd rather marry a stranger with honor than lose everything to that snake Ricardo. Carmen blinked at the name. Her jaw clenched. Miguel, Hannah said now, softer, almost pleading. Tell her the truth. Why'd you say yes? Miguel didn't look nervous. He looked tired. But there was something in his eyes that didn't waver. 'Cause I've been walking this town for a while now, he said, voice steady. Folks don't see much in me. I ain't blaming 'em. But when I saw her today, soaked through, eyes full of fire, running like the devil was behind her, I saw someone who still had something to lose, and I figured maybe just once I could be the man who helps instead of the one folks cross the street to avoid. That silenced even Carmen. She looked away first, and for a long, long beat, she didn't speak. Then, in a voice far softer than Hannah expected, Carmen asked, You got papers? Miguel nodded. Birth certificate. Social. Got 'em in my pack. Wasn't always like this, ma'am. Carmen let out a breath. Lord help me. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the hallway. When she returned a moment later, she was carrying a slim black ledger and an envelope. I kept this, just in case, she muttered. Didn't think I'd use it like this, but your granddaddy was a man of conditions, and this is the box we're stuck in. She handed Hannah the envelope. Inside were forms, marriage license, notarized documents pre-approved by the county clerk. Carmen shook her head. There's a pastor down the hill, friend of your grandfather's, still keeps odd hours and owes me a favor. We got 2 witnesses here, Lucinda and Earl, and your great-grandfather's wedding suit still hangs in the cedar closet. Hannah opened her mouth, but Carmen cut her off. You got 3 hours, Hannah Montclair. Don't make me regret this. She didn't. The house came alive in a way it hadn't in years. Lucinda, the old housekeeper, dug out her iron and pressed the cream silk suit. Miguel changed upstairs and came down looking like someone out of an old photograph, polished, dignified, the jacket a little tight at the shoulders, but somehow still regal. Hannah wore a simple white dress of her grandmother's soft cotton, not silk, but it hugged her frame and gave her back something she hadn't felt all day, belonging. The wedding happened in the drawing room. Rain still tapped against the windows, the fire crackling behind them. The pastor arrived just before 11, half asleep, but with eyes that sparkled at the absurdity of it all. Lucinda and Earl stood off to the side, hands clasped. Miguel and Hannah stood across from each other. No vows, no music, no kiss, just signatures. At 11:57 p.m., the ink dried. At 11:58, Carmen folded the certificate and placed it in the family vault. And at 11:59, Hannah looked across the room at Miguel and whispered, Thank you. He tipped his head once, quiet and respectful. Anytime. And somewhere far off, as midnight rolled in and Dust Creek held its breath, a future neither of them could have imagined, quietly began. The morning light slipped quietly through the wood-framed curtains of the Montclair guest suite, soft and golden, as if the house itself was trying not to wake its new inhabitants too quickly. Hannah stirred beneath a heavy quilt, unsure for a moment where she was. The scent hit her first something faintly musky and clean, like a man's cologne left on a pillow. And then it all came back in a rush. The wedding. The deal. Miguel. She sat up slowly in the large, king-sized bed, the silk nightgown her grandmother had loaned her clinging to her skin in the early chill. The other side of the bed was empty, but still warm to the touch. Not just a dream. From the adjoining bathroom came the sound of running water. She wrapped her arms around herself and sat still for a moment, letting the reality settle. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been abandoned in front of the whole town. Now she was married. Legally. The Montclair name and the fortune were still hers. The papers were signed with just 40 minutes to spare. And it was all because of a man she barely knew, who had turned out to be more honorable in one rain-soaked night than the man she had spent 3 years planning a life with. The bathroom door opened. Miguel stepped out dressed in the same borrowed slacks from the night before, a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His dark hair was still damp, slicked back lazily. There was something different about him now, less guarded, more at ease in the soft light of morning. "Good morning," he said gently, noticing she was awake. "Hope I didn't wake you." "No, I was already up," she replied, surprised by the hint of shyness in her own voice. Legally married or not, they were still strangers in most ways. But the sight of him standing there barefoot and relaxed stirred something uncertain inside her. "Did you sleep okay? That couch can't be too comfortable." He grinned. And Lord, when he smiled like that, his whole face changed. "I've slept in worse places," he said with a shrug. "Your grandma's sofa's nicer than some motels I've seen." She almost asked what he meant, where he'd slept, where he'd stayed, but a soft knock interrupted them. "Hannah, dear," came Carmen's voice from the hall. "Breakfast is ready. We've got things to talk about." 1 hour later, they sat around the long dining table in the formal breakfast room. The Montclair china sparkled under the morning sun. Crystal juice glasses reflected gold from the window. Carmen was already dressed for the day, as sharp and composed as ever, slicing into melon with surgical precision. "Well," she began after a sip of coffee, "now that the legal part is settled, it's time to discuss the next steps. Marriage isn't just about papers. There's perception and practicality." Hannah placed her cup back on the saucer and nodded. Her grandmother was right. Again. Yesterday saved the inheritance. But now comes the hard part. "The first order of business," Carmen continued, "is introducing Miguel to the management team. As your husband, he'll be seen as a stakeholder in the business." Miguel cleared his throat and raised a hand slightly. "With all respect, ma'am, I don't want anyone thinking I'm here to get my hands on your family's money. This marriage, it was for a specific reason. I never meant to intrude beyond that." Carmen studied him like a rare animal at the zoo. Her eyes narrowed, not in distrust now, but curiosity. "Interesting. Most men in your position would already be measuring the drapes in the executive suite." Miguel shrugged lightly. "I'm not most men." "No," Carmen said after a pause. "You certainly are not." Hannah watched her grandmother closely, catching something rare in her expression approval. But Carmen added, her voice shifting, "You are married to the owner of a company worth over 50 million. Whether you like it or not, the world will have questions, and appearances matter." Miguel nodded. "Understood." Hannah leaned forward. Her voice was softer now. "Miguel, I know this is complicated, and we didn't plan any of this, but I could use your help. Rodrigo was supposed to be my business partner too. Now I'm on my own." Miguel looked at her with a long, thoughtful stare. Something shifted in his posture. Less visitor, more participant. "What exactly does the business do?" he asked, his voice steady. "High-end textiles," Hannah said. We make premium fabrics, wool blends, silks, eco-cotton for fashion designers in Brazil and across Latin America. We have 3 factories, a design center, and about 200 employees. His brow lifted slightly. And what's the current challenge? Carmen jumped in smoothly. Imported products undercutting our prices. Outdated machines. A market that wants us to go faster and cheaper without sacrificing quality. Miguel nodded, considering it. Sounds like the story of every family-owned business I've seen sink in the last 15 years. You've seen a few? Carmen asked, watching him carefully. Miguel didn't look away. I used to be in distribution, logistics, had a decent setup, made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, got burned, real bad. Hannah leaned in. You don't have to tell us everything. I know, he said, but if I'm going to be around even just temporarily, it's fair you know this. I've got some ghosts, some that might catch up with me. We all do, Carmen said after a moment. What matters is what you do after they find you. Thanks, Miguel said. And for a moment that gratitude in his eyes was deep, bone deep. But the moment didn't last. Lucinda entered the room, her expression tight. Ma'am, she said to Carmen, there's someone at the gate asking for Miss Hannah. Says it's urgent. Hannah set down her fork. Her stomach turned before the name even came. Who is it? Fella says his name's Ricardo. The color drained from her face. Ricardo. She'd managed to not think about him for a few precious hours, but of course he wouldn't just vanish into the night without trying something. What does he want? Carmen asked, her tone dropping 10 degrees. He didn't say, Lucinda replied, but he looks riled up. Hannah glanced at Miguel. I'll go with you, he said immediately. She started to decline, then stopped. No. Actually, yes. You should come. If we're gonna make this marriage look real, we'd better act like it. They found Ricardo waiting in the front hall, pacing like a trapped animal. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled, and he looked nothing like the smooth-talking cousin from the rehearsal dinner. His desperation was written all over him. Hannah, he said when he saw her striding forward. Thank God I need to talk to you. Alone. Hello, Ricardo, she said coolly. This is my husband, Miguel. Ricardo froze mid-stride. His eyes darted from her to Miguel and back. Husband. What the hell are you talking about? We got married last night, Hannah replied calmly. After what happened with Rodrigo. His face went pale, then red, then nearly purple. That's impossible. You couldn't have... Not that fast. It's suspicious. Suspicious how Miguel asked, his voice low but solid like a warning under gravel. I mean, Ricardo stammered clearly, not expecting resistance. You barely know this man. How can you marry him? Hannah stepped forward, eyes sharp. Sometimes real help comes from the last place you expect it. Ricardo's expression crumpled, then twisted again into something darker. You don't understand, Hannah, he said. There are things about yesterday, about Rodrigo, about what she asked, though her gut twisted. Ricardo glanced at Miguel. It's complicated. Then simplify it, Miguel said evenly. You came here all urgent. Say what you came to say. Ricardo hesitated. For a brief second, it looked like he might tell the truth. But then his face changed. Calculating. Strategic. Actually, I came to confirm whether this marriage is legal, he said stiffly. It's awfully convenient, don't you think? You found a husband just hours before midnight? Makes people wonder. Miguel took a slow step forward. You want to question this marriage? Be my guest. But if you came looking for trouble, you might not like what you find. And for the first time, Ricardo took a step back. You think I'm just gonna let you and that Apache drifter take everything my family built? Ricardo's voice cut through the acrid smoke, sharp as a whip, his eyes narrowing at Hannah like she was a prize he'd been cheated out of. The air around the Montclair ranch was thick with the stench of burning timber and molten metal. The horizon choked with black plumes that rose like specters against the pale morning sky. Dust Creek's fire bells clanged in the distance, their urgent tolls echoing across the prairie, pulling folks from their homes to gawk at the disaster unfolding at the heart of the town's biggest enterprise. Hannah stood frozen, her hands still trembling from the news that had shattered the fragile calm of her wedding night. The ranch, the lifeblood of the Montclair legacy cattle pens, processing barns, the works, was burning. She could still feel the weight of her grandmother's borrowed dress, now swapped for a practical blouse and skirt, but the sting of yesterday's humiliation clung to her like the smoke in the air. Miguel, standing beside her, didn't flinch at Ricardo's jab. His weathered jacket was dusted with ash, his face streaked with soot from the chaos they'd just waded through, but his eyes held a steady fire of their own. "Actually, I came to confirm whether this marriage is legal," Ricardo said stiffly, his tone shifting, calculating, strategic. "It's awfully convenient, don't you think? You found a husband just hours before midnight. Makes people wonder." Miguel took a slow step forward. "You want to question this marriage? Be my guest. But if you came looking for trouble, you might not like what you find." And for the first time, Ricardo took a step back. The morning had started with a jolt, the kind that rips you from sleep and leaves your heart pounding. Hannah had barely closed her eyes in the guest room of Grandma's sprawling ranch house, her mind still spinning from the whirlwind of the previous night, Rodrigo's betrayal, the desperate marriage to Miguel, the weight of the Montclair legacy secured by mere minutes. She'd woken to the sound of pounding on the front door, Carmen's housekeeper, Lila, her voice high and frantic. "Miss Hannah, the ranch. It's on fire. You gotta come quick." Hannah's stomach had dropped, the world tilting again as if the universe was testing how much she could bear. She'd thrown on clothes, her hands shaking, and found Miguel already at the door, his face calm but his eyes sharp with purpose. "I've got an old wagon out back," he'd said, not waiting for her to argue. "We'll get there faster than on foot." The wagon, a rickety thing with splintered wood and creaking axles, was hitched to a pair of sturdy horses in Grandma's stable. It wasn't much, but it was enough, and as they rattled down the dirt road toward the ranch, Hannah clung to the seat, her mind racing faster than the hooves kicking up dust. The scene at the ranch was chaos, a nightmare painted in shades of flame and shadow. The main processing barn, where raw hides were turned into profit, was a roaring inferno, flames licking at the sky like hungry tongues. Workers milled about in a daze, some coughing from the smoke, others shouting orders that went unheard in the panic. The foreman, a grizzled man named Hank, who'd been with the Montclairs for decades, stood helplessly by the water pump, his face etched with defeat. "We're losing it, Miss Hannah," he said when she arrived, his voice rough with despair. "The whole barn's gone. Maybe more if we don't stop it." Hannah felt her knees weaken, the weight of her family's legacy pressing down like a boulder. This wasn't just a barn, it was the heart of the operation, the engine that kept the Montclair name alive. Without it, contracts would collapse, workers would lose their livelihoods, and the empire her grandfather built would crumble. She opened her mouth to speak, to rally, to do something, but the words wouldn't come. She was drowning in the heat, the noise, the fear. Then Miguel stepped in. He moved with a quiet authority that seemed to cut through the chaos like a blade through fog. "Hank, get the men to the east side," he said, his voice steady but firm, like he'd done this before. "The wind's blowing that way. Focus the water there to keep it from spreading to the cattle pens." Hank blinked, surprised, but nodded and barked orders to the crew. Miguel turned to the fire brigade, a ragtag group of volunteers led by a burly captain named Tom. "Captain, you got any hoses on the secondary pump? If we don't protect the raw material sheds, you'll lose more than just the barn." Tom, wiping sweat from his brow, studied Miguel for a moment, as if weighing whether to trust this stranger in patched clothes. But something in Miguel's tone, calm, precise, like a man who'd seen worse, made him nod. "You heard him, boys. Get those hoses moving." The crew scrambled, and within minutes the chaos began to take shape, a makeshift plan forming under Miguel's quiet commands. He directed workers to clear debris, organized a bucket line to douse smaller flames, and even climbed onto the roof of a nearby shed to check the wind's direction, his silhouette sharp against the smoke. Hannah watched her shock giving way to something else. Curiosity, maybe, or awe. This was no ordinary drifter. The way he moved, the way he spoke, it wasn't the fumbling of a man scraping by on odd jobs. He knew machines, knew systems, knew how to lead. The workers, hardened men who rarely took orders from anyone but Hank, followed him without question, their eyes reflecting a grudging respect. Even Tom, the fire captain, kept glancing at Miguel as if waiting for his next move. But then Ricardo arrived. He rode in on a sleek black horse, his tailored coat out of place amid the ash and ruin. His face, usually smooth with charm, was tight with something darker, anger maybe, or desperation. He dismounted his boots, hitting the ground with a thud, and made a beeline for Hannah. "This is a disaster," he said, his voice loud enough to draw eyes. "And you running off to marry some Apache nobody. What's this game you're playing, Hannah?" Her stomach twisted. Ricardo's concern was a mask, thin and brittle, barely hiding the venom beneath. She'd always known he envied her place in the family, but the way he looked at her now, his eyes darting from her to Miguel, then to the burning barn, felt like a predator circling its prey. "I'm not playing anything, Ricardo," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I did what I had to. The will's clear. I'm married. The ranch stays with me." His lip curled, and that's when he spoke the words that hung in the air, sharp and accusing. "Actually, I came to confirm whether this marriage is legal. It's awfully convenient, don't you think? You found a husband just hours before midnight. Makes people wonder." Miguel's step forward was slow, deliberate, his eyes locked on Ricardo. "You want to question this marriage, be my guest. But if you came looking for trouble, you might not like what you find." Ricardo hesitated, his bravado faltering under Miguel's gaze. The crowd around them, workers, firemen, onlookers, fell silent, sensing the tension. Hannah's heart pounded not just from Ricardo's words, but from the way Miguel stood unflinching like a man who'd faced worse threats and come out standing. Ricardo muttered something under his breath, then turned and stalked back to his horse, his departure as abrupt as his arrival. The fire was under control by noon, the flames reduced to smoldering embers, though the barn was a blackened skeleton. Hannah stood amid the wreckage, her boots sinking into the ash-soaked ground, her mind a tangle of grief and questions. The ranch was saved barely, but the cost was staggering. She turned to Miguel, who was wiping soot from his hands, his face unreadable. "You're not who you say you are," she said, her voice low, almost lost in the crackle of dying flames. "Nobody gives orders like that, knows machines like that unless they've run something big. Who are you, Miguel?" The fire was under control by noon, the flames reduced to smoldering embers, though the barn was a blackened skeleton. Hannah stood amid the wreckage, her boots sinking into the ash-soaked ground, her mind a tangle of grief and questions. The ranch was saved barely, but the cost was staggering. She turned to Miguel, who was wiping soot from his hands, his face unreadable. "You're not who you say you are," she said, her voice low, almost lost in the crackle of dying flames. "Nobody gives orders like that, knows machines like that unless they've run something big. Who are you, Miguel?" He looked at her, his dark eyes heavy with a story he'd kept buried for too long. The wind carried the faint scent of charred wood, and for a moment the world seemed to pause, waiting for his answer. "My name's Miguel Tahoma," he said finally, his voice steady but laced with a quiet pain. "My father was Chief Joseph Tahoma of the White Mountain Apache, a man of honor respected by our people and even by some of the white folks in Dust Creek. But he was murdered 2 years ago, and I've been running from that truth ever since." Hannah's breath caught her mind racing to process his words. Murdered. The word hung between them like a storm cloud, dark and heavy with implications. She wanted to ask more, but the way Miguel's shoulders tensed, the way his gaze drifted to the horizon, told her this wasn't a story he shared lightly. "He was looking into something rotten in this town," Miguel continued, his voice dropping lower as if the words themselves carried danger. a web of lies and greed that was tearing apart both our people and yours. Your cousin Ricardo, he was at the heart of it. Her stomach twisted, the name hitting like a punch. Ricardo, the man who'd always lingered on the edges of her family, his smile too slick, his questions about the ranch too pointed. She thought of his accusations at the fire, his insistence that her marriage to Miguel was a sham. "What do you mean, Ricardo?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did he do?" Miguel's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer, his presence steadying her against the chaos of the day. "My father found out Ricardo was playing both sides, your family and mine. He'd been stirring up trouble for years, pitting the Montclairs against the Apache, spreading lies to weaken us both. He paid off folks to sabotage your cattle deals, spread rumors about bad meat to scare off buyers. And with us, he'd whisper about land grabs, get our young men riled up, ready to fight. Also, he could swoop in when both sides were too broken to stand." Hannah's knees felt weak, the weight of his words pressing down like the heat of the desert sun. She thought of Rodrigo, the man she'd loved who'd left her at the altar with nothing but a cold message. "Rodrigo," she said, her voice trembling with realization. Was he part of this too? Miguel nodded, his eyes softening with something like pity. Ricardo got to him. Found out Rodrigo was in deep with gambling debts, owed money to some rough types in Tucson. Offered him a way out, cash to disappear, to leave you standing there in that church. It wasn't just about hurting you, Hannah. It was about making sure you lost the ranch, the whole Montclair legacy, so Ricardo could claim it. The truth landed like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold. She saw Rodrigo's face in her mind, his charming smile, the way he'd promised her a future, all of it. A lie bought and paid for by her own cousin. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms. "How do you know all this?" she asked, her voice sharp with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Why should I trust you?" Miguel's gaze didn't waver. "Because I've got no reason to lie. My father died trying to stop Ricardo. He was close to proving it all. Letters, payments, names of men Ricardo bribed. But someone got to him first. A knife in the dark out on the reservation. I found him, Hannah. I held him as he bled out, promising I'd keep our people safe. I failed him then, but I ain't failing you now." His words carried a raw honesty that cut through her doubt. She saw the pain in his eyes, the kind that comes from carrying a wound for too long. It was the same ache she felt, the betrayal of someone she'd trusted, the loss of a future she'd believed in. She wanted to reach out to touch his arm, but the weight of the moment held her still. They returned to Grandma's mansion that afternoon, the air heavy with the smell of rain and ash. Grandma was waiting in her parlor, her silver hair pulled back, her face as unyielding as the oak table she sat at. She listened as Miguel recounted his story, her sharp eyes flicking between him and Hannah, weighing every word. When he finished, she rose and crossed to a locked drawer in her desk, pulling out a stack of papers, letters, ledgers, and notes, some yellowed with age. "I had my suspicions about Ricardo," she said, her voice steady but cold. "After your grandfather passed, I hired a man to keep an eye on him. These came in last week, records of payments to men in Tucson, some to Rodrigo. I didn't want to believe it, but it's all here." Hannah's heart sank as she scanned the papers, her fingers trembling. Names, dates, sums of money, all pointing to Ricardo's schemes. She looked at Miguel, then back at her grandmother. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small but growing stronger. "We bring him to justice," Grandma said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. She picked up the telephone, an old rotary model that seemed out of place in her elegant parlor, and called Sheriff Dawson. "I want a warrant issued for Ricardo Montclair," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "And I want it done today." By evening, the sheriff's deputies arrived at the mansion, their boots echoing on the polished floors. Ricardo was there, pacing like a caged animal, his face flushed with a mix of fear and defiance. "This is nonsense," he shouted as the deputies cuffed his wrists. "I didn't do anything. You can't prove a thing." But the evidence was damning: arson tools found in his saddlebags, a witness who'd seen him near the barn before dawn, and the papers Grandma had provided. He thrashed against the deputies, his voice rising to a desperate wail. I'm a Montclair. This ranch should be mine. You're all fools." Hannah watched her heart heavy but resolute. The man she'd once called family, who'd smiled at her across dinner tables, was gone. In his place was a broken figure consumed by greed and ambition, his dreams of power crumbling like the barn he'd set ablaze. She felt no triumph, only a quiet sorrow for what might have been. As the deputies led Ricardo away, the town buzzed with the news. Reporters from the Dust Creek Gazette swarmed the ranch, their pencils scratching, eager for a story. Miguel stayed out of sight, refusing their questions with a shake of his head. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and gray, he found Hannah on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. "They want to make you a hero," she said, glancing at him. "The man who saved the Montclair ranch." He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the distant hills where his people's land began. "I don't need nobody calling me a hero," he said softly. "I just needed you to know the truth. That's enough." Hannah studied him, the lines of his face etched with a strength she hadn't seen before. She thought of the Apache craftsmen her grandfather had admired, their intricate weavings and carvings, far surpassing anything the white settlers could produce. They'd thrived in a world that tried to break them, turning skill and resilience into something enduring. Miguel was like that, she realized, a man who'd lost everything, but carried a quiet power rooted in honor and craft. "You didn't just save the ranch," she said, her voice steady. "You saved me, and maybe my family's name." He looked at her then, and for a moment the weight of their shared losses seemed lighter, shared between them like a burden carried by two. The stars began to appear faint against the fading light, and Hannah felt something stir, a fragile hope, not yet fully formed, but enough to carry her forward into the uncertain days ahead. 6 weeks had passed since the fire, since Ricardo's schemes unraveled, and he was hauled off in cuffs, his shouts echoing through the town. The Montclair ranch, once a smoldering ruin, was rising again, its new barns and processing sheds standing proud against the prairie horizon. The rebuilding wasn't funded by the deep pockets of cattle barons or city bankers, but by an unexpected source, Miguel's Apache community. They weren't flush with cash, far from it, but they had something stronger: trust in Miguel, a man who'd walked away from his birthright yet still carried the respect of his people. He'd gone to them hat in hand, not as a beggar, but as a son of the White Mountain Apache, asking for help to save a legacy that wasn't just Hannah's, but a piece of Dust Creek's heart. They'd answered with what they could: savings from craftsmen, contributions from families, even livestock traded to cover costs. It was a quiet kind of wealth built on loyalty and skill, the kind of skill that wove intricate blankets and carved wood with a precision that left white settlers in awe. The workers at the ranch had noticed it too. They greeted Miguel each morning with nods that carried more than politeness. There was respect in their eyes, the kind earned by a man who didn't just give orders, but worked alongside them, hauling beams and checking machinery with a knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his patched clothes suggested. Hank, the foreman, had taken to calling him boss, half in jest, but the nickname stuck, and soon the crew treated him like he'd been running the place for years. Hannah watched it all, her initial shock at his leadership, giving way to a quiet realization: Miguel wasn't just a drifter who'd stepped into her life by chance. He was a man who'd chosen to stay, to fight for her family's legacy when he could have walked away. But trust didn't come easy. Not after Rodrigo. Not after the lies and betrayal that had left her standing alone in a church, her dreams in tatters. She'd spent weeks wrestling with doubts, wondering if Miguel's help was too good to be true, if his quiet strength hid some ulterior motive. The question had been burning in her chest for days, and tonight, as they stood on the porch with the crickets humming in the distance, she couldn't hold it back any longer. "Miguel," she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be, "did you ever think about using me? To get a piece of the Montclair name, the ranch, the money?" His face changed, the easy calm replaced by something raw, almost wounded. "If I wanted that," he said, "I'd have picked a better way than marrying you in the rain, wearing your granddad's old suit with nothing but a preacher and your grandma as witnesses." He took a step closer, his boots scuffing the wooden boards. "I did it 'cause you needed help, Hannah, not 'cause I wanted your money. I've walked away from power before. I don't need it now." Her cheeks burned, shame mixing with relief. She wanted to look away, but his gaze held her steady and unflinching. She saw the truth in his eyes, not just the words, but the man behind them. The one who'd pulled her from the mud, who'd faced down Ricardo, who'd rallied a community to save her family's legacy. He hadn't just saved her ranch. He'd believed in her when she'd doubted herself, when the weight of betrayal and loss had nearly crushed her. That belief, quiet and unshakable, was what stirred something new in her heart. Not gratitude, but something deeper. Something that scared her as much as it warmed her. Their days began to weave together, a rhythm forming in the chaos of rebuilding. They worked side by side at the ranch, Hannah handling the ledgers, while Miguel oversaw the machinery, his hands deft as he repaired pumps or tightened bolts. They sat through long meetings with suppliers, arguing over prices and delivery schedules, their voices sometimes sharp, but always finding a balance. In the evenings, they'd linger over coffee in the ranch office, the lamplight casting shadows on the walls as they talked, not just about the business, but about life, about the land, about the dreams they'd both buried. Hannah found herself laughing again, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months, and Miguel's rare smiles, fleeting but warm, became something she looked forward to. Grandma watched it all from her parlor, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She'd sit in her high-backed chair, a cup of tea in hand, her silver hair catching the light as she observed the way Hannah's shoulders relaxed around Miguel, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. One afternoon, as Hannah brought her a stack of contracts to review, Carmen set her cup down and fixed her granddaughter with a knowing look. "You two are the answer to each other's troubles," she said, her voice firm but warm. "Don't you go fighting it, Hannah. Life's too short for that." Hannah didn't respond, but the words stayed with her, settling into her bones like a truth she wasn't ready to name. She thought of them later when the work was done and the stars began to speckle the prairie sky. Miguel had asked her to come with him, not to the ranch, but somewhere else, somewhere that mattered to him. "I want you to see something," he'd said, his voice quiet but insistent. "It's important." They rode out in the old wagon, the same one that had carried them to the fire, the horses' hooves kicking up dust as the town faded behind them. The land opened up wide and wild, the grasses swaying under a sky so vast it seemed to hold every possibility. Miguel guided them to a stretch of earth marked by low hills where the air felt different, older, heavier, like it carried the weight of generations. He stopped the wagon near a cluster of stones, their surfaces worn smooth by time, and helped Hannah down, his hand lingering on hers just a moment longer than necessary. "This is where I buried my father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes fixed on the stones. "After they took him from me. This land, it's where my people have lived, loved, fought for centuries. The Apache. We don't just survive. We build, we create. Our hands weave stories into every basket, every piece of wood we carve. White folks might have thought they could outdo us, but they never could. Not really." Hannah listened, her heart tight with the weight of his words. She'd heard her grandfather talk about the Apache craftsmen, their work so fine it shamed the settlers' attempts. Miguel's people had thrived in a world that tried to break them, their skill and resilience a quiet defiance. And now, standing here, she saw that same strength in him, the son of a chief, a man who'd walked away from his birthright, but carried it in his bones. "I came back here a few days ago," he continued, his voice steady now, "to tell my father I was ready to take up what he left me. The White Mountain Apache need a leader, and I can't run from that anymore. I'm gonna be their chief, Hannah, like he was. Not for power, but for them, for the promises I made." She nodded, her throat tight. She thought of the ranch, the way he'd stepped in to save it, not for glory, but because it was right. "You're not running anymore," she said softly. "I see that." He turned to her, then the starlight catching the edges of his face, making him look both fierce and gentle. "There's something else," he said. "My people, we've always said the sun bears witness to love. It sees the truth of it, burns away the lies. I married you to help you, Hannah, to keep your family's name alive. But standing here now with you, I want more. Not because of some will or some ranch. Because of us." Her breath caught the words, stirring something she'd tried to bury. She thought of the rain-soaked night they'd wed, the way he'd stood by her when she had nothing but a broken heart and a ticking clock. She thought of the days since, the way his quiet strength had become her anchor, the way his laughter had started to feel like home. "I'm scared, Miguel," she admitted, her voice trembling but honest. "After Rodrigo, after everything, I don't know if I can trust my heart again." He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, not grabbing, but offering. "Then we'll take it slow," he said. "No rush, no pressure. Just you and me figuring it out under these stars." She looked up at the sky, the vastness of it stretching over the land that held both their histories. The Apache sun, the Montclair legacy. They were tied together now, not just by a hurried marriage, but by something real, something growing. She didn't have all the answers, but as she stood beside Miguel, the weight of the past 6 weeks felt lighter, like a burden shared. For the first time in a long time, Hannah felt the stirrings of a future she could believe in, one built not on promises or schemes, but on trust, quiet and steady, under the watchful stars. The sun hung low over the rolling hills of Dust Creek, casting a golden glow across the sacred ground where the White Mountain Apache had gathered for centuries. The air was warm, thick with the scent of sage and wild grass, and the crowd, Apache elders, Dust Creek townsfolk, ranch hands, and merchants stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit with a quiet awe. Today wasn't just a ceremony. It was a bridge between two worlds, a moment where past and present, Apache and Montclair, wove together under the watchful sky. Hannah stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding, not with the fear she'd felt 6 months ago in that rain-soaked church, but with a certainty she hadn't known she could feel again. She wore a traditional Apache dress, its soft deerskin adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the light patterns of stars and rivers stitched by the hands of tribal women who'd welcomed her like family. The dress wasn't hers by birthright, but they'd insisted their smiles warm as they draped it over her shoulders, saying it was right for the wife of their chief. Miguel stood beside her, his broad shoulders squared under a woven sash, the symbol of his father's chieftainship, a carved medallion of turquoise and bone resting against his chest, placed there by the tribe's eldest woman, Grandmother Lita, whose trembling hands had carried the weight of tradition. His dark hair was pulled back, his face calm, but alive with something new, something that looked like pride, not just for himself, but for what they were building together. The ceremony was simple, guided by Apache customs, yet it carried a weight that silenced the crowd. An elder chanted softly, his voice rising and falling like the wind calling on the sun to witness their bond. Hannah felt the eyes of both communities on her Apache families who'd traveled miles to see their chief reclaim his place, and Dust Creek locals who'd whispered about her whirlwind marriage, but now stood in quiet respect. The worlds that had once clashed, divided by history and mistrust, seemed to pause, their edges softening as they watched two people, once strangers, pledge their lives to each other under a sky that belonged to them all. The Montclair Ranch, reborn from the ashes of Ricardo's betrayal, had become more than a business. It was a partnership now, not just between Hannah and Miguel, but between the ranch and the Apache community. They'd launched a new venture, clean produce grown on Montclair land, paired with cultural tourism that invited visitors to learn the Apache ways of weaving, carving, and living with the land. The idea had come from Miguel late one night as they pored over plans in the ranch office, his voice steady but alive with possibility. "My people have always known how to make beauty from what's around us," he'd said, his hands tracing the air as if shaping one of the intricate baskets his tribe was known for. "White folks might have money, but we've got skill, skill that lasts. Let's show 'em what we can do together." Hannah had listened, her heart catching at the way he spoke not just of his people, but of them as if their futures were already entwined. The venture took off faster than anyone expected. The ranch's fields, once grazed only by cattle, now bloomed with crops tended by Apache hands, their harvests sold under a label that bore both the Montclair name and the White Mountain Apache seal. Tourists came drawn by stories of the land and demonstrations of craftsmanship that left them marveling baskets so finely woven they seemed to hold light carvings that told stories older than the hills. Dust Creek's reputation, tarnished by years of feuds and greed, began to shine again, its name whispered with pride in Tucson and beyond. Miguel took on another role, one that seemed to fit him as naturally as the medallion around his neck. He founded a non-profit to teach Apache youth the trades of their ancestors, weaving leatherwork woodworking, while helping them navigate a world that often shut them out. He'd spend hours with young men and women, his voice patient but firm, showing them how to turn raw materials into art, how to carry their heritage into a future that didn't always welcome it. "You're not just making things," he'd tell them, his hands steady as he guided theirs. "You're carrying our story forward." Hannah watched him, marveling at the way he led, not with force, but with a quiet strength that made people want to follow. Hannah, too, found her own path. She'd always been the Montclair heiress, the one expected to carry the family name, but now she wanted more, not just to inherit, but to build. She started an academy for young women, a place where they could learn to manage ranches, negotiate contracts, and stand tall in a world that often tried to keep them small. She named it after her grandmother, Carmen's Academy, and on the first day, as she stood before a group of nervous but eager faces, she felt a spark of the strength Grandma had always seen in her. "You don't need to wait for permission," she told them, her voice steady. "You take your place and you hold it. That's what we do." The newspapers couldn't get enough of it. The Dust Creek Gazette ran headlines calling Hannah and Miguel the couple of the New West, a pair who'd torn down walls of class and race to build something stronger. Reporters clamored for interviews, but Miguel always waved them off, his jaw set. Hannah, though, kept a scrapbook clipping articles to show their children one day, if that day ever came. Grandma took it further. She sat down with a pen and paper, her hands steady despite her years, and wrote the foreword to a book about their story, her words simple but piercing. "This is a tale of two people who found each other in the dust and made it bloom." She wrote, her handwriting elegant but unyielding. "It's the story of Dust Creek, of what we can be when we choose trust over fear." Not everything was resolved so neatly. A letter arrived one morning, its envelope stamped with the seal of the state prison. Ricardo's handwriting was unmistakable, the scrawl shaky but deliberate. Hannah held it, her fingers tracing the edges, her heart caught between anger and curiosity. She read it alone in her office, the words spilling out in a rush of regret and excuses. "I was wrong, Hannah," he wrote. "I let greed blind me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm sorry." She stared at the page, searching for the cousin she'd once known, the boy who'd raced her across the prairie on horseback. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd burned her family's legacy to ashes. She lit a match, held it to the paper, and watched it curl into nothing, the smoke rising like a final farewell to the pain he'd caused. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Hannah stood in the middle of a grassy field, the ranch sprawling behind her. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and possibility. She heard the soft thud of hooves, the creak of a saddle, and turned to see Miguel riding toward her, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. He dismounted, his movements easy, practiced, and led his horse to her side. The medallion at his chest glinted, a reminder of the chief he'd become, the man who'd chosen to carry his father's legacy after years of running. "You're looking at me like you're trying to figure something out," he said, a half smile tugging at his lips. Hannah laughed, the sound soft but real. "I was just thinking about how we got here," she said, her voice steady though her heart raced. "All this us, the ranch, your people, mine. It feels like a miracle. But it wasn't, was it?" It was my granddad. He brought you to me." Miguel's smile deepened, his eyes warm as he stepped closer, the horse grazing quietly behind him. "Maybe he did," he said. "Maybe that old man of yours knew something we didn't. But I'm staying, Hannah. Not 'cause of him, not 'cause of some will. I'm staying 'cause of you." She felt the words settle into her like a seed taking root in good soil. The prairie stretched around them, vast and unending, a witness to the life they were building, not just a marriage, but a legacy that wove their stories together. She reached for his hand, her fingers finding his, and for the first time she didn't feel the weight of the past, only the promise of what lay ahead glowing like the sunset that held them both.